Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I am Thea Lee, president of the Economic Policy Institute. For 35 years, EPI has been the workers' think tank. Our researchers conduct intellectually rigorous research and policy analysis to advance the interests of working families through economic policy, often challenging conventional wisdom and fundamentally shifting the terms of debate. EPI research and advocacy builds power for working people through partnerships with national and state grassroots activists, and together we work toward widely shared justice across race, gender, and income lines. I am delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Promoting a New China Policy that Invests in America. We are fortunate to have with us this morning Senator Bob Casey. Senator Casey has been a fighter and a champion for working families and the middle class throughout his career, and certainly since he was elected to the U.S. Senate from Pennsylvania in 2006. Senator Casey will provide some overview remarks on U.S.-China policy, how it connects to our domestic policy objectives and our national goals. Then we will hear from Rob Scott, EPI Senior Trade Economist, Heather Hurlbert, Director of New Models of Policy Change from New America, and myself. And then we will have more discussants in a little while with Jeff Foe, Kathy Feingold, and Mike Wessel. I invite you to put your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we will answer them as time permits. Without further ado, it is my great honor and privilege to introduce Senator Bob Casey.
Well, Thea, thanks very much. I want to thank you and the Economic Policy Institute for this opportunity. We all know that EPI has been at the center of the fight for justice and fairness for over 3 decades. And Thea, on a personal note, I understand that you're about to head to the Biden administration. I know that's a loss for EPI, but a great gain for the nation. The nation will benefit from your public service, and your leadership at EPI, as well as the AFL-CIO before that, has been invaluable in shaping the debate and discussion around workers' rights, equity, and progressive trade policy. So I'm glad that the rest of the world seems to be catching up to the trail that you've blazed. So thanks very much for your work. And also I want to thank your founding president, Jeff, who I can see on my screen, for joining this important discussion. We continue to benefit from Jeff's foresight and vision on critical issues facing our workers and the economy. EPI has always put the needs of workers first and has questioned over and over again corporate policies that undermine workers. And as we emerge from this COVID-19 pandemic and the terrible economic crisis it brought on, I believe the United States is at an inflection point in history. We've heard that a lot lately, but I think it's certainly true on the issues we'll discuss today. At home, we're working to address so many challenges. Just by way of one example, the racial justice challenge, and so much more. And we think about it globally. We're in right now, I believe, or entering at least, a new era of great power competition between our nation and the Chinese Communist Party. In order for our workers to win that competition, we must take an all-inclusive approach to our domestic and foreign policy to make fair competition the driving principle. We must ensure our workers have the tools necessary to win the competition, not just to compete, to win. But we must also be clear-eyed about the challenge ahead of us. We're in a competition with a communist government. The reason our workers and our firms face challenges that maybe previous generations couldn't imagine is not because we were out-hustled or out-innovated by China, as some might contend, and some in Washington might contend that, but because firms in China have explicit state backing. The Chinese government restricts access to their market and steals our technology for the benefit of their industries. The Chinese Communist Party plays by different rules. Some argue that China builds things faster and better, and better than we can. You've heard that narrative. Well, that's just not true. The structures they build are not built to last. As we approach a future of competition with the Chinese Communist Party, We hold no animus towards the people of China, or of course, Chinese Americans, who every single day enrich America and help build our country. The only good news recently on bipartisanship, we hope there's more, but the only good news recently is that the United States Senate, as divided as we are, and we are divided, the Senate spoke with one voice against hate and against hate crimes against Asian Americans. And we need to do more of that kind of work. We know that for the last few decades, and I certainly know this from the perspective of Pennsylvania, many working Americans have not been able to get ahead. And many working Americans believe that their children's lives will be worse than theirs. Maybe the first generation that's believed that. Multinational corporations and the super rich have benefited from a rigged tax code for at least 40 years, if not longer. While workers who produce the corporate wealth that those corporations benefit from, while all that's going on, workers are suffering. The American promise of opportunity for all that we've come to believe as we were growing up has increasingly been only opportunity for the wealthy and the well-connected. Now, President Biden's taken critical steps through the enactment of the American Rescue Plan and the two proposals that he just announced recently, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. He's taking steps to enhance our competitiveness and support workers, small businesses, and families across the country. These investments are critical to ensure that all Americans can benefit, and that unions that built our country and built the middle class are front and center in the American recovery, in the American future. In order to lead the world in a more democratic direction, we must insist that the power of people to shape their future at the ballot box also includes economic power. Democracies cannot endure without policies that empower workers and invest in children. To achieve economic growth that makes fairness and social change a reality, the worker must be at the center of our agenda for change. The worker drives the growth, and therefore our nation has a stake in that worker's health, that worker's skills, and that worker's economic security. As business has achieved a larger but less fair share of the pie, both at home and abroad, American standing, stability, and security have been compromised. We know our workers and our businesses can outcompete anybody in the world if the playing field is level, and we know that the United States thrives on competition. However, we also know that non-market economies like China are working to recreate the global economic system in a manner that advantages their communist mercantilist system, of course, at the expense of American workers. The US needs a sustained and coordinated strategy to address the threat posed by China. And the US should work with our allies to execute it. This is not a problem unique to the United States, and there's no need to treat it as such. If core democratic principles of fair competition are going to survive, we must do a couple things. Number one, consider and evaluate the necessary changes to our trade policies to institute a system that supports our national objectives. Second, we need to build alliances to support fair competition across nations. And third, we've got to deploy a comprehensive and coordinated strategy that I mentioned to address the ways countries and companies exploit the global economic system to take advantage of workers. The Chinese Communist Party, the government, views as concessions what we consider necessary conditions. Those conditions are to participate in the economic system of the world. If we're going to confront China and prevent the export of its economic model, the United States must support the following principles. I'll articulate today 5 principles. Number 1, fair terms of trade. Number 2, fair competition and economic conditions. Number 3, fair labor standards and workers' rights. Number 4, protection of our national security interests and critical capabilities. And finally, number 5, policies that invest in our children and our communities. So let's get to the first one, fair terms of trade. That's the first principle. The current structure of the international trade system must change if it's going to support competition, resiliency, workers, and our security interests. Let's take, for example, just one example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. There are many in the foreign policy community who continue to believe that that leaving TPP was a huge mistake. They're wrong, not because the stated objectives of the agreement were wrong. Rather, they are wrong because the rules of the agreement did not support the stated objectives. TPP, as written, would have allowed, on average, over 50% of originating content to come from China, thereby further enmeshing US supply chains with the authoritarian Chinese government. That doesn't make any sense in terms of a strategy. Fair competition is a core American economic value. As our new trade representative, Catherine Tai, has said, quote, meeting this moment will require all of us to have an open mind and embrace the tremendous possibilities that come from thinking outside the box. It means looking at old problems in new ways, unquote. Well said by Catherine Tai. Of course, this will require developing and deploying that comprehensive strategy to address the ways countries and companies take advantage of the global economic system, from exploitation of workers to polluting the global commons to cyber-based espionage, forced technology transfer, and theft of intellectual property. So to address these challenges, we've got to update and enhance the rules of origin. We've got to work with our allies to align action on trade safeguards. And we've got to address the emerging threat of extraterritorial censorship by the Chinese government. Let's go through a couple of these. First, on rules of origin. With regard to the structure of our trade agreements, half of content can originate from China and still enter the United States through a free trade agreement. That's not right. In the context of TPP, rather than aligning an economic bloc to counter China, it would have further intertwined US supply chains with the Chinese government. Any future trade agreement must include a supplemental rule of origin for non-market economies. This means countries like China cannot free ride on trade agreements anymore. The Market Economy Sourcing Act, which is Senate Bill 4008, does just that. And that's the kind of legislation we should be considering. The US also should consider adopting similar measures with respect to Buy America and Buy American policies. Next, let's look at coordination and reciprocity with allies on trade safeguards. Under our current trade safeguard measures, the United States has the ability to protect the domestic market from dumped and subsidized goods, but we don't have the necessary tools to protect our workers when they compete against those dumped goods in foreign markets. The impact of subsidies don't stop at the water's edge. We should consider working with allies to create a common defense against illegal subsidies from non-market economies like China. This could mean establishing reciprocal remedies against trade distortions, such as illegal subsidies. Measures could be limited in scope, such as anti-dumping or countervailing duties on goods from these non-market economies. We've got to work with our allies to better protect our manufacturers' ability to retain market access abroad in the face of these illegal subsidies. The US must continue to work with allies to address the pernicious threat of overcapacity. Next, extraterritorial censorship by China. We've seen the Chinese government act in an increasingly assertive manner with regard to this censorship. Senator John Cornyn, Republican of Texas, member of the Republican leadership for years, he and I held a hearing on censorship as a non-tariff barrier to trade just last year. And the issue has only gotten worse since then. So there's bipartisan focus and interest on this kind of an issue. At our request, the International Trade Commission is undertaking a study on extraterritorial censorship. But we must also consider providing USTR with enhanced tools to address these issues. Measures could include disclosure of censorship requests by non-market economies, backed by strong responses by our federal government. This is a concern for our firms as well as our allies. In March, the EU, the UK, and Canada joined the US in imposing sanctions on Chinese officials related to Xinjiang abuses. Meanwhile, China is using its market access as a weapon against Australia, a key ally and a Five Eyes partner. To that end, I fully support the administration's clear and repeated articulation of their support for Australia. Finally, the Chinese Communist Party dictates virtually everything that enters its market. These actions are part of a broader effort by China to reform the global economic and social environment in a manner more consistent with its authoritarian system. Let's move to our second principle, fair competition and economic conditions. The current global trading system allows countries like China to cheat largely with impunity. My home state of Pennsylvania knows all too well what may be in store for states and communities across the country if we don't address the systemic threat that the Chinese government's economic agenda presents, the threat it presents. Over the past several decades, the Chinese Communist Party has expanded subsidies for steel, aluminum, transportation, and other critical infrastructure, thereby cornering the market through state-directed investments. And now we're seeing the same playbook for emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, biotech, and robotics. Here's the unfortunate record that we saw in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania suffered record manufacturing job losses over the last generation. According to the good work done by EPI, the good research, China cost the United States 3.7 million jobs between 2001 and 18. 2.8 million jobs, 3/4 of the total jobs lost in that roughly 17-year time period, were in manufacturing. 3/4 in manufacturing. That number, that 2.8 million jobs nationally lost in manufacturing, translates into 137,300 jobs just in Pennsylvania. Job numbers alone, of course, provide little insight into the family and community trauma, real pain and trauma that ravaged so many small towns in Pennsylvania, and I know across the country. That's why we must continue to support our domestic steel and aluminum industry and work with our allies to prevent the Chinese government from stealing our future, either by stealing our intellectual property or by manipulating their currency, or by pushing our manufacturers out of business by dumping cheap products in our country. The threats to a fair global economic system exist everywhere. They come from abroad and right here at home. Here's one, the 2017 Republican tax bill, which I have labeled an obscenity. Sorry about that for a morning discussion. But that tax bill creates an incentive to offshore jobs and manufacturing. The Chinese Communist Party entices firms with subsidies and the promise of cheap labor, only to steal industrial secrets and drive competitors out of business with cheap goods. Fair competition starts at home by ensuring firms making it in America aren't disadvantaged against large multinational corporations that ship jobs and production offshore. And countries that cheat on trade like China must be held to account. So we can do a couple of things. First, we can retain the current 232 and 301 tariffs while undertaking a full-scale review of our international trade and economic policies and postures. Second, we can strengthen Buy American procurement requirements and establish supplemental rules of origin for these non-market economies. If we don't make something in the US, we should be buying it from our allies who share our high standards. We need to update our procurement contracts and reporting requirements related to disclosure of country of origin products, I should say, used to fulfill these contracts. We must ensure strong labor standards are included in any Buy Clean framework. The objective of reducing domestic and global climate pollution and improving sustainability across supply chains is a hollow endeavor if workers are exploited in the process. While discussions on Buy Clean framework continues, we should consider establishing a tiered national level reporting structure for labor rights and conditions. For example, countries with high labor standards, tier 1 countries like the US, UK, or the EU, would be presumed in compliance. Production and supply chains coming from countries on lower tiers could have enhanced monitoring, inspections, and reporting. Inputs and products from tier 4 countries, those engaged in gross labor violations or human rights abuses, would be barred from eligibility in a quote, Buy Clean framework. Our third principle, protecting our national security interests and critical capabilities, is one that doesn't get enough attention. The Chinese Communist Party's regional and global objectives create direct and indirect economic and security challenges. The UN Conference on Trade and Development estimates that roughly one third of global shipping goes through the South China Sea, and 1/2 of global trade ships through China. Efforts by the Chinese government to control port infrastructure and shipbuilding, both in the region and globally, through the Belt and Road Initiative, should be an alarm bell for all of us. The Belt and Road Initiative is not simply about ports or railroads or creating projects to absorb China's overcapacity. Belt and Road, BRI, is about influence. It's about influence. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic and increasing tension in the Indo-Pacific region is exposing cracks in China's model of doing business. That's some good news. Countries are recognizing the drawbacks of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Initially enticed by major investments in infrastructure, developing countries are recognizing the unsustainable debt burden brought on by BRI and are now looking to the IMF and other international institutions for relief. China's human rights record is also under increased scrutiny. When forced labor is the floor, no worker can compete. And the Chinese government has made no secret of its actions on that front. The genocide in Xinjiang is shedding new light on forced labor as a major part of its agenda, China's agenda, that flouts human rights. Everywhere you turn, the Chinese government is weaponizing its institutions to suppress dissent and democracy in order to better control resources, control water, control the factors of production. This includes the Chinese government's continued repression and torture of the Tibetan people, as well as its efforts to tamp down the democratic aspirations in Hong Kong. Across sectors, defense, trade, development, China's government's malign agenda is being exposed and coming under increased scrutiny. We got to continue that. The Chinese Communist Party's lack of values-driven governance is a vulnerability. It's a vulnerability that we can exploit. China's broader military ambitions are also necessary considerations in the trade and economic sphere because China's government's growth agenda blurs the lines between its economic and defense sectors via its civil-military fusion. So we have some opportunities to keep the pressure on. Now, China's investments in and theft of technology and innovation supports the expansion of its security and its security posture through development of surveillance technology nuclear-powered submarines, and products across the commercial spectrum. This means the Chinese government doesn't view competition strictly through the lens of dollars and cents. When Chinese firms and state-sponsored enterprises compete against America's, it does so with broader objectives in mind, including those of their military. I want to talk for a moment just about manufacturing. Manufacturing is core to our economic competitiveness. In the United States, manufacturing represents only about 11% of our GDP, but it's responsible for 70% of our R&D, according to an analysis from McKinsey. Manufacturing drives innovation. When you lose manufacturing, of course, you lose innovation. And countries that don't make things usually don't endure. We've all seen too clearly the cost of relying on China for our nation's critical capabilities. Worse still, we have very little visibility on what our vulnerabilities are and what may exist with respect to production dependencies in other sectors. So here's what we've got to do. And this is something that's long overdue. We've got to engage in a comprehensive ongoing review of our critical supply chains and our capacities to gain visibility on vulnerable supply chains. Second, we've got to establish outbound investment review mechanisms to ensure that we're not losing critical capacities to foreign adversaries. I don't have to tell anyone about what just happened in the midst of this pandemic, how dependent we were on other countries for critical supply chain. The administration is currently embarking on a comprehensive supply chain review for critical capacities. That's good, but it's not enough. This is an action I proposed in the American Leads Act, which was last year's Democratic proposal on competitiveness. Now, the Senate right now is undertaking a bipartisan effort across several committees of jurisdiction, foreign relations, commerce, and finance, to tackle the competitiveness challenges that we have and to tackle them head on. In the coming weeks, we hope this effort will culminate in a comprehensive, bipartisan, Senate-wide China competitiveness package that will task the US government with meeting this challenge. And by the way, I think this stands a good chance of passage. Ensuring our critical supply chains, ensuring that they're secure and taking remedial action against those vulnerabilities I spoke of is an essential element of this effort. Our fourth principle, fair labor conditions and worker rights. Wow, talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in Washington. Some fundamentals first. All workers should have the right to equal protection under the law, to join a union and to have freedom of association, and to earn a wage that allows them to provide for themselves and their families. No worker should fear violence and harassment. Our trade policies must support and uphold these rights for workers everywhere, not just in the US. In many countries, laws restrict women's rights. Rights to own property are restricted, to inheritance, to divorce, to child custody, to open a bank account, and even equal access, of course, to education. The Chinese government thrives on the repression and exploitation of people, both its own citizens and those around the world. Equal protection under the law, regardless of gender, is a fundamental human right. The advancement of women's rights and economic empowerment is not simply a matter of human rights, it's a matter of economics and global security. For example, Dr. Valerie Hudson, a professor at Texas A&M, just released a book entitled The First Political Order, which analyzes comprehensive empirical data on the status of women around the world. Here's what Dr. Hudson found, among other things. She documents how discrimination against women has significant consequences for the entire society, with worse outcomes for conflict, worse outcomes for security, for economic performance, governance, and food security. So to advance the rights of women globally, we've got to modernize the generalized system of preferences, so-called GSP. Modernizing and strengthening standards within GSP should include adding standards on human rights, women's rights, and economic empowerment, as well as non-discrimination and violence and harassment in the workplace. Legislation I authored, the Women's Economic Empowerment Trade Act, or Senate Bill 4008, would do just that. Second, we should incorporate the rights of women as core U.S. trade policy objectives. USTR Catherine Tai has committed to making the advancements of the rights of women a core U.S. trade policy and a policy objective at USTR. I look forward to working with USTR on this effort. Also, we've got to engage in ways that invest in the American workforce and industry and reestablish standards of pay, conditions of work, and benefits that reflect our values as a nation and places the conditions for fair competition of workers at the helm of global security and our global economy. Number 5 principle, and last, another issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention, but that's starting to change. Investing in our nation's children and our communities. We can't simply look outwardly to address the challenges posed by China. We also must have the economic and structural conditions at home, not just to do well, not just to compete, but to win the future. And that requires significant investment and a long-term commitment to our workers. It also requires a commitment to our infrastructure and investing in our communities and, of course, in our most precious resource, our children. 1 in 7 of our children are growing up in poverty. 1 in 7. That's almost 11 million children, more than the population of a lot of states. A nation cannot continue to prosper if 1 out of 7 of its young brains are not provided the opportunity to both develop and succeed. While aptitude is distributed universally, opportunity is not. And some of our best and brightest, some of our creative thinkers aren't able to achieve their full potential because they grow up in poverty, we all pay. All of us pay. We pay when our nation's children don't reach their full potential. I think we're finally, maybe just finally, starting to realize this. Finally, let me just say a few words about the worker in the context of this discussion. The worker drives growth, and it all starts with our children before they're born. We must build an American compact before and after birth. The first is a guarantee of a healthy birth, and the second is a guarantee of a healthy start. We need both. A healthy birth for every child requires, among other things, access to family planning for women so they can time their pregnancies. Second, comprehensive prenatal care. Third, universal health coverage to address poor health outcomes, including maternal mortality rates. In 2020, I proposed what I called the 5 freedoms for America's children. I gave credit and acknowledgement on the first page to FDR's 4 freedoms, but this is in the domestic context, of course, for children. And here are the 5 freedoms. The freedom to be healthy, the freedom to be economically secure, the freedom to learn, the freedom from hunger, and the freedom to be safe from harm. We have more time later, we can go into what the policy is. The good news is that Biden administration is getting to work on all 5 freedoms. So when we express these, I believe these are the fundamental requirements necessary for a healthy start for every child. By investing these resources in our children, we'll lay a foundation for economic growth that rivals the world. At the same time, our nation must focus on the urgent work of helping the workers of today and the communities wherein they live. How do we do that? Well, a couple of things. And these are some final remarks. When a community experiences a large job loss or is undergoing industrial transition, it can have a devastating impact on the entire region, as we know. We must enact automatic economic and fiscal stabilizers to support regions through these challenging times. By establishing assistance that turns on the onset of an economic shock, we can avoid much of the economic pain that communities have experienced. Not all of it, but we can eliminate some of it. Supporting the tax base, local businesses, supporting schools, supporting workers, and preventing the hollowing out of towns we've seen all too often are just some of these examples of how we can help. In supporting communities and workers, it's also essential we protect workers' ability to collectively bargain and organize and reverse the steady erosion of workers' rights in the workplace. Researchers like MIT professor Zeynep Tan have shown us that there are other ways forward as well. Investing in employees pays off. This research affirms what we've known for a century. When companies invest in their workers, when workers are empowered to bargain for salary and compensation, everyone is better off. And EPI, of course, has led the way on that research for so many years. So we got to fight back against the relentless attack on unions. And it's all across the country at the state level and in Washington as well. And we've got to also halt the proliferation of practices like forced arbitration and non-compete agreements that strip workers of their ability to challenge discrimination and unfair labor practices. We must ensure that we, as the president said, build back better, that we have to make sure that no workers are left behind as we do that, that they're not left behind as technological change or automation may upend large sectors of our economy. We also have to make sure that workers aren't cast out as, quote, digital day laborers, unquote, without rights or recourse. So we got to support working parents as well through access to quality, affordable childcare. Just one big example of how we got to help those families. And we can do that, among other ways, by some of the investments we're making, starting with the rescue plan and other initiatives. One of them is an issue I've worked on, making the expansion of the child and dependent care tax credit, making that permanent, just like we need to make the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit permanent. Let me conclude with these thoughts. You've all heard this before, but it bears repeating. The International Labor Organization, ILO, began with a recognition that, quote, universal and lasting peace can be accomplished only if it is based on social justice, unquote. And that humane conditions of labor were essential to bringing about that justice in the first place. The worker must be at the center of our agenda for change in order to advance fairness and justice, freedom, security, and human dignity. America is strong when our workers are strong and economically secure. America is strong when our communities are strong. America is strong when we can provide for the least among us, and when parents don't worry, for example, that lead poisoning in the water their children are drinking will be a condition of American life. We also know that America is strong when our alliances are strong and based on shared democratic values. America is also strong when our domestic and foreign policy vision is grounded in democratic values, supporting workers, supporting the middle class, and those striving to lift themselves into the middle class. So our task is to, at long last, lift up our workers and lift up their children so that American workers won't just compete, so that American workers will win the future. I believe this is a task worthy of a great nation. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Senator Casey. That was very far-ranging. You touched on a lot of things, and I think one of the key things is what we've been talking about for a long time, which is how do we connect what we do in the global economy, whether it's through trade or foreign policy, with our objectives as a nation about strong families, strong workers, strong labor markets, a strong economy. And I think what we're starting to see, certainly from this administration, that's why this talk is so timely, is certainly the desire to start making those connections and to say that we can't actually have a strong labor market. We can't protect workers' rights at home, and we don't do that good a job of it in the United States if we are part of a global economy where workers' rights are trampled and disrespected, and where American corporations are taking advantage of lax worker rights enforcement or protections around the world. So this is a very important, very timely set of issues. A lot is on the table. Let me turn to my colleague, Rob Scott. He is a senior economist and the director of manufacturing and trade policy at the Economic Policy Institute. And Rob, the floor is yours. Unmute. Unmute.
I always do that. Thank you. Thanks, Thea, and thanks, Senator Casey, for your fascinating comments. It's going to take a long time for me to digest. Fortunately, we have a broad panel of commentators here to address all of the issues that you raised. I want to focus in my remarks on core issues of trade and manufacturing policy that you've raised, and just add a couple of points. I would start by focusing on some of China's unfair competition in basic industries, and just set the floor here and remind our listeners that China has really come to dominate a range of basic industries, as you point out accurately, by overinvesting in these industries and creating massive overcapacity. In steel and aluminum, for example, China has expanded production capability by on the order of 1,500% in the last 15 years. And so they now produce more than half of the steel and aluminum in the world. And this has flooded world markets, depressed world prices, and caused massive job losses in these core sectors. But it's not just the steel and aluminum that matter. China is the biggest exporter of steel in the world, for example, but it consumes over 85% of the steel it produces and uses that dumped and subsidized product to achieve dominance in its sectors like autos and auto parts and industrial machinery and electronical machinery and appliances. All of these have been dominated by China in part because of its subsidies to basic products. So we have to confront all of these things. And of course, our trade laws, unfortunately, have not been updated in nearly 30 years. Last major reform of the Trade Act was in 1998. And 1988, pardon me, 88 amendments. And they don't really reflect the fact that China now dominates the world in so many products and commodities. So we need to address that as well. But in particular, as you mentioned, the 232 tariffs need to remain in place until we come up with a way for dealing with unfair trade in these industries. And it's not just China. There are many countries that follow China's example, such as Korea, Japan, and more recently India and Brazil. But it's not just the developing countries. There are unfair traders in Europe as well, in the Netherlands and Germany and even Britain. So this is a global problem, and we need global solutions. And I look forward to continuing global negotiations to address this global excess capacity in these sectors. I just want to focus on one other issue, which I would like to see more attention on in the Senate and in the Biden administration, and that is currency. The single largest cause of growing trade deficits around the world and in the US in particular is the the overvaluation of the US dollar. The US dollar is overvalued by about 25%. This is due to two factors: 15 years of massive currency manipulation, illegal, widespread currency manipulation by China and about 20 other countries, again, many in East Asia, but also including countries like Switzerland and other oil exporting countries. This has resulted in suppression of the value of those currencies, which acts like an artificial subsidy to everything they export to the US and the rest of the world, and a tax on US exports to those countries, not just to China, but to the whole world. And the result is that we have lost, in the past 20 years, 5 million manufacturing jobs, as you point out, half of them to China. We've also lost 91,000 factories. So we can't produce many of the goods that we need to buy American, as we have been targeting. So I think more attention to currency policy is central. This doesn't just involve currency manipulation. It also involves excessive inflows of capital into the US, and I've worked on proposals to address that as well. There's a bill by Senators Tammy Baldwin and Josh Hawley that would impose a tax on foreign capital inflows that would help, again, rebalance the dollar, bring it down to a competitive level, reduce it by about 25%, and thereby rebalance trade and create millions of good jobs in America. And that would create incentives to buy more American products, both for the government and the private sector. So with that, I'll turn it over to our next discussant. Thea, do you want to guide?
Yes, thank you so much, Rob. And next, I'd like to introduce Heather Hurlburt. She's the Director of New Policy, sorry, got it wrong, New Policy Models at New America Foundation. And we are thrilled to have Heather with us. She is an expert on foreign policy, and we look forward to her remarks. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Thea, for having me. And I'm going to start with a maybe unexpected or maybe obvious comment, which is one of the things we need to make these changes Senator Casey was talking about is more Senator Caseys. And what do I mean by that? All of us who work in this field the way it sits right now, as you could hear from Senator Casey's remarks, are contending with a variety of domestic, foreign policy, security, economic, social, childcare issues. And we have failed over the last couple of decades to raise up a generation of policymakers who can think. And I mean, I could name on two hands the number of folks in Washington who can talk as knowledgeably about gender, trade, and China as Senator Casey just did. And I'll just add as a little point of privilege that the number of men who can talk knowledgeably about those three things, I think I can count on less than one hand. So a thing that all of us can contribute to this wherever we're sitting, where Thea's coming from or where she's going, is to really make a point of breaking down the silos around our own work and making sure that folks who are coming up after us are fluent in at least two of these domains. And frankly, when we have a conversation about one of them, demanding that perspective from the other be brought to bear. And why do I say that? I will dig a little bit more into the international piece in order just to underline some of these. Now, it's been said, Senator Casey, you said, and many others have said, this set of policies is not actually primarily about China. It is primarily about us. It is about what kind of society do we want to have? How do we want to treat working people? And fundamentally, do we want to have a democracy based on rough measures of equality? Or do we want to continue to head down the road toward instability and autocracy that we know increasing inequality produces? That's really the question here. And at the moment, the Chinese Communist Party is our foremost foreign adversary, but the Chinese Communist Party weren't the folks who tried to storm the Capitol on January 6th. Let's just say that's not something they're ever going to be able to manage to do. So first of all, let's keep our eye on the prize for that reason. Second, because as Senator Casey said, the temptation to build this whole case around China is really accentuating acts of prejudice and violence against Asian Americans. And it's adding fuel to a larger culture that we just lived through 4 years of, suggesting that those kinds of attacks and appeals are an appropriate way to build unity in our society. And we want to reject that very strongly. But the third reason that we want, I'm going to somewhat ironically, for foreign policy terms, we want to be clear that what we're doing is for the benefit of our own people and not because we have some implacable or irrational objection to the existence of China, is that frankly, as was said, We can't do this without allies and partners. And our allies and partners are simply not ready to be forced into a binary choice between Washington and Beijing. And they also don't see the interests of their working people as benefited from a binary choice between Washington and Beijing. So as we go forward, we're going to want to keep all the serious concerns that Senator Casey raised in mind. And I don't discount for a minute the espionage or the illegal state capitalism or the appalling genocide in Xinjiang or other abuses of workers, activists, and citizens. But to the extent that we are not forcing allies and partners to choose, but instead are offering better models, are offering better ways that respond to the challenges they face, we're going to do better. And so what's that going to look like? It's going to look like increased efforts internationally to get at supply chain and worker rights issues. And to do that, not just at home, as the Biden administration has very wisely begun to do, but to figure out how we do that with allies and partners at the same time, some of whom, frankly, have been out there doing much more on supply chain human rights over the last 4 years while the Trump administration was a bit absent. Similarly, on the question of climate and how we build a trade system, an international economic system that is climate friendly rather than climate hostile. There again, a number of our partners have been out there doing the work while we were at best absent over the last 4 years. So we're going to have to, from the beginning, in a way that's very unusual and hard for Americans to think about, we're going to have to build these systems with other countries rather than build our own first and then tell others how it's going to be. But I think that's an important opportunity, especially for American working people, because it potentially creates, and I hope Kathy Feingold will talk a little bit about this when we get to her, it potentially creates some real opportunities for transnational worker solidarity in ways that we haven't seen really, that we've been disappointed in our inability to produce since the end of the Cold War. But this is a really interesting moment where that is changing. The last point I want to raise, and it's again to pull out something Senator Casey said and try to develop it a bit, is that all of this need to change the framework, to internationalize the framework, and to think about what are the principles that we want to carry out the same both in domestic policy and international policy. We want to think about manufacturing and technology together. And you don't really need any better argument for why we need to do that than looking at Amazon, frankly. But there are a number that we're going to have to, there's a bunch of trade and international economic battles that we're going to have to fight. There are also some new upcoming ones, artificial intelligence, regulation of artificial intelligence, data privacy and security, where again, frankly, in some cases, some of our allies have adopted more worker-friendly, more civil rights-friendly frameworks than we have. In some cases, we have to have, and I know Senator Casey and his colleagues are having some of those debates at home, but we will further the goals of this conversation more if we are thinking at the same time how we build frameworks that we would like to export or share. And again, to circle back to my point, when, as I think they increasingly will, our allies kind of glumly come to the conclusion that they are going to be faced with more of a hard choice regarding their economic engagement with Beijing than they like to tell themselves now, we need to be really sure that we have appetizing, attractive alternatives in those tech areas every bit as much as in the manufacturing and defense sector areas. And with that, Thea, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. And those are terrific points, both Heather and Rob. And let me say one thing. I really like the way you put it, Heather, that it's not about China, it is about us. And I think that at the end of the day, the United States has to figure out our priorities, our sequencing. And this has been what's been wrong with US trade policy in the past, is that the corporate dominated model has won out. And, but if you think about how directly connected our failures at home are to our bad trade policies, I think that connects up to Senator Casey's point, which is that, we've had 4 decades of attacks on unions at home, and we've had a globalization policy that encouraged and rewarded companies for taking jobs overseas where they could take advantage of workers who lacked basic human rights and protections. So if we want to turn that around, we really need to figure out not just how do we have different trade policy and how do we stop China from violating workers' rights and cheating on trade deals, but how do we, live our principles at home in terms of supporting workers and families and figuring out how that goes. Senator Casey, I know your time is limited, so I wanted to see if you had any comments or responses right now before we move on, because I know you can't stay with us the entire time.
Well, Thea, thanks again. And I was reminded as listening to both Robert and Heather about how heavily I rely upon their scholarship and research. And I think that's true of the two great staff people that are on this call, Livia and Bali, who worked to put these remarks together today. If I was tasked with doing all that by myself, we'd all be in trouble. And I know how much they rely upon that scholarship and research as well. And I can't tell you how much we appreciate that, because as I think we've emphasized a little bit this morning, we need to have these engagements a lot more than we do, frankly, even within the Democratic Party, when it comes to working men and women and what we've got to do to advance their agenda, their future. And as you said, they are talking about unions. I mean, frankly, there's not in Washington, not enough utterance of the word union. That just saying unions and the right to organize and how it's under threat and how we have to fight back against it. The PRO Act and so many other initiatives are critical to this. And I think the points made by both Heather and Robert bear repeating in terms of what we've got to do in Washington about getting our own house in order and making sure we're that example for the world on a whole host of fronts. Just make one point about obviously the importance of trade policy, what's happened over the last couple of decades. That's, there have been some bipartisan failures there, but also what, the combination of trade policy, the unionization declining for so many years. That in the 1950s, we were above a third of the country unionized, and now it may not even be barely 10%. That's when you combine trade with attacks on unions. And then a third element, not exclusively three, but a third element is tax policy. We've had a tax code that's been rigged for at least 40 years. The research that was done just, I think it was 2019, it was completed, that focused not just on the off-repeated 1%, that's there's so much analysis we could do on that. But how about the top 400 families, the 400 wealthiest families in America? When you add up what they were paying state, local, and federal taxes. 1980, the year Ronald Reagan was running for president, that group of 400 families was paying 47% of their income in taxes, 47%. The last time we checked, I think it's 2018, 23%. And that 47 was a lot lower than it was in 1950, in 1960. So we've seen these giveaways to very wealthy Americans, to the wealthiest of the wealthy, and to major corporations, in addition to regulations being rigged in their favor. And you can understand why one of the reasons we have such a big divide in America is because most Americans, their wages have been flatlined. So you combine trade policy, tax policy, and anti-worker assaults over several decades now. And you can see why, one of the reasons why we're so divided, because people feel they have no control of their economic future. And so all of this is relevant to our discussion, but I will leave the rest of the conversation to the professionals, because it's better in their hands. But I'm grateful to have been part of the discussion this morning.
Thank you, Senator Casey, so much for joining us today, and we really appreciate your time and your remarks. It's great to have you, and we look forward to further conversations. I don't think we've really finished this conversation at this point, and I think I would add the one more thing in terms of connecting the domestic to the international, which is the failure to invest at home in infrastructure or in renewable energy is connected to the wrong kind of globalization policies. To the extent that corporations were doing their production and making their profits overseas, they were less interested in paying taxes at home or investing in infrastructure. And so I think we've had really a confluence of bad decisions that were connected between bad domestic decisions and bad global policies. So I thank you for your remarks today and for helping us put all this together. We look forward to continuing to be in conversation with you about these important issues at this moment in history. So thank you so much. And don't go away. We have more discussants coming, and we are looking forward to a longer conversation. So we're here till 10:30. So I'm just saying for the participants, please stick with us. And thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce our three discussants. We are going to have three more discussants that we've asked to join us today. The first is Jeff Foe. Jeff is the former president of the Economic Policy Institute, my former boss. Jeff has been a tremendously insightful and thoughtful commentator on globalization policies since he and I worked together in the early 1990s at EPI on NAFTA and the WTO and China policy a long time ago. And maybe I'll introduce all three of our speakers at this point, our discussants, so that we can move smoothly through this. And then we will hear from Kathy Feingold, who is the Director of International Affairs at the AFL-CIO, my former treasured colleague, and an expert on all things international worker rights. And finally, Mike Wessel, who is a revered member of EPI's board representation and is also a member of the U.S.-China Economic Security and Review Commission, where I had the good fortune to serve with him for a couple of years. And I am tremendously in awe of his knowledge and wisdom. So with that, Jeff, looking forward to some comments from you.
Okay, well, thank you, Thea, and this has been a pleasant morning for me. Someone who has been chopping weeds in this part of the woods for a long time, I can't tell you how nice it feels to have this kind of conversation and presentation by a senator, which breaks down the silos, as I think Heather was talking about, which is extremely important. And a president, I mean, the last Wednesday night's speech was something I thought maybe I would go to my grave without hearing from an American president. But I'm in a very good mood about all of this stuff, and especially when you look at the polls and the country supports this stuff. And as Heather said, or maybe Senator Casey said, finally they're catching up. And so I'd like to just make two comments about where we go from here. First is this: to do this right, to revitalize American competitiveness and to do all of the things that we've been talking about is complex, difficult. The president the other night said it's going to take at least 8 years, at least 8 years, I would say. We're talking about putting the country on a new trajectory. And there's going to be a lot of resistance, as we know, a lot of resistance to doing the kinds of things we're talking about, despite the fact that they make sense. And even the economics profession finally has been dragged kicking and screaming into some of these proposals. Well, it's going to take a long time, and it's going to require a strong government. You can't do this thing in the way we've been operating for the last 4 decades, assuming that somehow the market is going to make our wishes prevail. Most of the work, as usual, will be done in the private sector. But who's going to do the actual designing, the monitoring, the building of systems and the management of systems, from 5G to electric cars to all of this technology, monitoring supply chains around the world? You need smart, committed bureaucrats. You need engineers, scientists, project managers. You need people who are in, not just at the top, working at the White House, but you need people in the civil service, state and local and federal, quality people to make this happen. Unfortunately, since Reagan, we have been demoralizing and creating dysfunction in much of our public sector, disorganized. The COVID experience is just one illustration of that. So my first point here is that in order to do this right, we're going to have a new generation of civil servants. And today, we're fortunate in a way because we've got a whole army out there of educated, frustrated young people stuck in dead-end jobs who can't pay their college tuition, college bills, debts, and are looking for meaningful careers. The New Deal, the Great Society, their successes, and I think the Great Society was historically is certainly a success, although it didn't last. But they brought thousands of new people into government service, and I just think that as we know, any business, any enterprise, anything runs on its people. And revitalizing and strengthening the civil service in America at all levels, I think, has got to be a priority if what we're talking about is going to be at all possible. John Kennedy started by saying, ask not what you can do, what the country can do for you, but what you can do for the country. I think we're ready for that because there's a vision here of rebuilding America that for young Americans is a place to consider working for the rest of their lives. And so that's my first point. We've got to have the right people to do this, and I've got to move on. The second, the president the other night talked about working families, foreign policy for working families. Amen about that. And we've heard a lot about that, but I would caution about making this too much of an ideological war against China. I think I know that's good for getting support from some places, but it can be very counterproductive. And let me give you the example that the senator was talking about, TPP. TPP was an alliance against China. It would have further crippled, as we know, working families in this country. It was certainly not a foreign policy for working families. Alan Kruger, who was Obama's chief economist, said, trade policy now is mostly about foreign relations. And I go all the way back to the fight against NAFTA, when I was told by a number of members of Congress, well, you may be right about the economics, but Carlos Salinas, who was president of Mexico, is our guy. So my caution here is about making this, excuse me, a crusade against China, rather than focusing on the foreign policy that we need in order to rebuild this country. And I think first of all, while 25 years ago, we might have had the leverage to change China internally. I think we blew that. And right now we have a very limited power to decide that. The foreign policy priorities, I think, are rules of trade, including labor standards, of course, and global warming. And I liked what the senator said about buying clean means labor rights as well. So we should be careful about selling this thing and getting into the same kind of situation where it was the Pentagon and the State Department driving trade policy, not the Labor Department and the civilian agencies. Okay.
Thank you, Jeff, so much. Kathy.
Thanks so much, Thea. And I know we're short on time here. I'm going to jump off of where Jeff just left us, which is we absolutely need rules for the global economy for all countries. Let us be clear. The US needs to follow, US corporations need to follow different rules. And I love the fact that we are in Washington, DC, and now we have lots of people talking about we need policies that center the well-being of working people and their families and the environment as guardrails, as how we realign our objectives of foreign policy. But I'm getting a lot of questions. What does this mean? Let me be clear what it means. It means a new social contract, like our president said, to give workers a fair shot. This is well-paying, climate-friendly jobs, enforcement of rights, access to social safety programs, social protection programs, equality, inclusive, sustainable development. That's a framework. That is not just about US and China. That is creating a framework in the global economy to realign the objectives so that we can make sure it's balanced and works for working people. This can't just happen through bilateral trade. We need it to be a multilateral engagement. We also need one issue that hasn't been raised enough here. I want to make sure is part of this is the tax question. We need a minimum corporate tax, because far too long, we've had the race to the bottom on labor, race to the bottom on environmental protections, and a race to the bottom on tax. We heard about the Reagan years, but if you look at the global minimum tax floor, it has gone plummeting. So in order to rebalance the global economy, we need all of those pieces, a new social contract that works for workers in the US, so that workers in the US, China, all over the world can rebuild their trust in those governmental institutions, Jeff, that you think we're going to bring new people into. People have lost faith. You have to prove that democracy delivers for people. And that's what we need to do. Two other quick issues in response to the senator's comments on the global supply chain. Let's be clear that forced labor has no place in the global supply chain. And coming out of the Leaders Summit last week, we heard a commitment to climate-friendly jobs for workers. Workers are going to need to see proof of this. And I think one solid example of this is how we get our renewable industry. Currently, forced labor is a big part of how the solar industry is functioning. We need a commitment from this government, a strong one that shows that we will not allow products being made with forced labor to enter our country. 36% of the global supply chain, polysilicon, the first input into solar, comes from a region in China where there's forced labor. Let me be clear, China is not the only country where forced labor is happening. Mauritania, other countries of the world, this has to be solved. This is not just, and it has to be solved in our own country, the egregious worker rights violations. Let's be clear, our corporations have been complicit. They have known if they were doing due diligence, like they say they do, they always like to tell me they're doing due diligence, there would have been red flags about what is happening in the Uyghur region of China and in many countries around the world. They would have known that workers are being forced to work in solar and tomatoes and cotton for many of the products entering our market. Let me end on a positive note, because I know we need to get to Mike, which is I think we're shifting right now to building those guardrails that are binding and enforceable. We have the rapid response mechanism tool in USMCA that we hope will be a floor that's replicated. We see Europe getting mandatory due diligence rules. So we're creating a global architecture that will allow this new social contract to flourish. And I think we need to continue to push on that here in the US as well. Back to you, Thea, and over to Mike. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Mike.
Thank you. And Thea, I had a long set of accolades for you, but I'll just say we wish you well in your new, as the new chapter unfolds, and appreciate all that you've done for so long. Let me start with the normal Washington disclaimer that the views I express are only those of myself. Senator Casey looks at trade policy through the eyes of workers, and he's been their tireless advocate. He offered an integrated approach to dealing with trade, which is a critical addition to the debate on trade. It's been somewhat disjointed, a set of individual items not joined together with a framework. And I think we should be judging any policy approaches against the framework which he identified today. Let me quickly echo Rob Scott's emphasis on the desperate need for action on overcapacity, which challenges each of the principles which the senator identified. President Trump dealt with some of the symptoms of China's policies, but he did little to address the root causes of the threats their actions pose to our manufacturing base and its workforce. Dismantling his measures, like the Section 232 relief Rob talked about, that's not the answer. Supplementing them with other policies is. President Trump ignored multilateral engagement on steel overcapacity. Granted, our trading partners and the Chinese appeared to use the prior engagement as a way to divert U.S. attention and policy making. The talks really achieved nothing. In the area of overcapacity, we need effective disciplines backed up by automatic enforcement measures with our allies. If our allies are unwilling to participate, they are part of the problem and should be treated as such. Heather talked about binary choices, and that's a much deeper debate. We should be working with our allies, but there is a binary choice as we look at the end result of these policies, and that's whether our workforce and our workers are being assisted or whether they're being injured. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. So at this point, we have just about 15 minutes left, but what I would like to do, I'd love to hear all of you bouncing off each other and off of some of the issues that Senator Casey rose, but maybe I'll do it this way, which is to ask each of you, and maybe we'll go in the same order that we've been so far, to tell me one thing that you are hopeful about at this moment in history, something that, that's been a problem in the past that you think could change, and why is that important? So, but feel free to, to bounce off and reference each other's points or Senator Casey's points. So why don't we just do that as our organizing principle? Rob? Unmute.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I think that the points that Mike made about the need for multilateral solutions to these issues, need to set them in context, and think about the interconnections here is absolutely critical. So with that, I'll pass it on. Yes.
Heather?
I'll pick up on Jeff's point, which is an absolutely fair one, about how the bad mistakes we made by letting foreign and security policy and trade and economic policy get totally divorced from each other. And although we're not there yet, I'm actually optimistic that we've got an opportunity to teach some folks and raise up a new generation of professionals on the foreign policy side who understand that you don't make good policy, you don't serve the nation's interests unless the two are very closely lashed up together.
Great, thanks. Jeff?
Yeah, and as I said before, I think that what's exciting for me is the notion, for the first time in 40 years, that the American government is an instrument of democracy. That, ever since Reagan said this was the problem, not the solution, the public debate has been following that for 40 years. And I think the COVID has helped, and in a perverse way, even Donald Trump helped begin to change that whole dynamic. And I think maybe we can have an adult discussion about the uses of government for at least the next 20 years.
Great. Kathy.
Well, I am hopeful because the fact that everyone talks about workers now is a big step forward. I know many of us have been trying to do this for years. And I'm hopeful because I see new tools that are being created that give transnational movements power. I mentioned some of them. We've moved away from thinking that corporations can actually monitor themselves into compliance, and to understanding we need worker-driven accountability tools. And I think our government understands that you need tools that are quick, enforceable, and have real consequences.
Great. Mike.
I am truly excited and hopeful because of the direction the president has set our country on, and the people he's chosen to help staff him, with many coming from the labor movement. Julie Green, Celeste Drake, who was named earlier this week, Thea, your upcoming participation in the administration, and many others I don't have time to name. I think they are devoted to advancing the interests of America, its ideals, and the interests of working people.
Great. Let me pick up on one of the questions from the Q&A, which is about how do we align our fair trade policy with our climate goals. And I think each of you have talked about some aspect of this, about how does this connect to investment? How does it connect to foreign policy? How does it connect to workers' rights? So let me just invite any of you, you can all unmute yourselves, and we can just invite your thoughts on the challenges ahead with respect to making progress on climate, but also what are the changes we need in terms of our attitudes towards our trade policy, the implementation of our trade policy, and how does it intersect with other objectives? Anybody?
Well, I'll just quickly say that, and again, this goes back to the comments Kathy made about, and Heather, about the integration of trade and foreign policy. I think we see that these aren't, that trade is not just one separate inbox from foreign policy, from economic policy, and from climate policy. So I think we're going to see integrated approaches that are going to achieve our ultimate goals, which I think the president's been pretty clear in identifying.
Kathy?
I think we're at a moment where people are rethinking the global architecture and the frameworks that we need. And one of them is absolutely around the siloing of climate and jobs. Our trade agreements replicate this. You know, we have the labor and the climate chapters. And I think, you know, and at the WTO level, we're at the global labor movement's been asking them to look at the integration of these issues. We need binding enforceable tools that work both on the climate issue as well as the labor issue. So I think that is where we're going. And, you know, just transition policies, you can't do one without the other. You cannot, and again, this is where I go with the new social contract, needing social protection. You know, if you're going to have job loss and a transition, we need the floor underneath workers, which includes a whole set, you know, bridges to pension and investment into their communities. And so I think you can no longer have these pieces siloed. And I'm excited that people are starting to build those frameworks together.
Jeff, and then Rob.
Yeah, I think that the politics has changed too. I mean, what's driven the sort of the issue of climate change has been basically the environmental movement. And the environmental movement has, with some exceptions, been rather indifferent to the question of what's happening to working people. And I think that's changed because now it's a much broader set of interests. And the future is, we have no future without dealing with the climate change question. And I think that, you know, part of what Senator Casey said about a four-tier framework for looking at these questions of buying clean, those kinds of things now are, you know, in the mainstream of discussion. And that's a big leap forward.
Rob?
Yeah, I want to just add and get into the weeds a bit on the integration of trade and climate policy. These are core issues, and I'll take the discussion right back to again to steel and aluminum and some of these other basic industries. The production of steel, for example, in China, which generates half of the world's steel, generates roughly 3 times as much carbon per ton as does steel production in the United States. Some of the steel companies are verging on pure carbon neutrality, a net zero production of carbon in the United States. So I think that we need to adjust for that in setting trade and tax policies. Simple way to do that is twofold: have a carbon tax in the United States to discourage carbon reduction here, but we also have to adjust it at the border. So if companies want to import steel from China, we have to assess a carbon tax on that steel as well, in addition to all the other measures we've talked about. So I do think we need to integrate trade and tax policy, but in a very specific micro way as well.
Can pick up from that, and I'll tell you 2 things I'm actually worried about. And one is exactly this question of carbon tax and carbon border adjustment, where the rest of the world, sort of moved ahead in thinking on these issues while we lost the last 4 years. And there's a lot of watching to see if we can get our domestic house in order on those questions. And there's a lot of interest in mechanisms globally, which might not be the same mechanisms that the Biden administration thinks it can get through Congress. So number one, we're looking at kind of a misfit there. How are we going to be ready to work with the EU on a carbon border adjustment, for example, in the next year or 2? And then that leads me to another place that I think we're going to have bigger problems than we have yet recognized. And that is that the EU in particular, but many other key nations in the fight against climate change, want to do the work of updating trade law and standards through the WTO. And that is a prospect that many folks in the American space, I see Thea smiling, have a lot of skepticism about for a lot of good reasons. But we are going to run into a wall where we have domestic ideas about how those rules should be changed, what that should look like. And frankly, the rest of the world, in part because the rest of the world has done a lot better job of equalizing the benefits of globalization domestically than we have, frankly. But they're going to look at us and say, your problems are domestic, they're not with the WTO. Why are you being all Trumpy and wanting to break down international cooperation? And that's going to be just a very big challenge to the kinds of things that President Biden is trying to do at home that I think we don't quite yet have enough smart minds figuring out how we can go forward on both fronts.
Mike?
Let me just quickly say, and I appreciate, Heather, the comments, that if the rest of the world asks us to apologize for the last 4 years, they are more likely to result in a Trump-like figure to come back in 2024. Trump was, captured the views of many working people who didn't see their government fighting for their interests. President Biden is doing that. If the rest of the world says, slow down, for the last 4 years you were absent, the result is we're not going to be able to achieve what Senator Casey asked about, promoted, and what we all know is necessary. So the rest of the world needs to be pretty careful about how they approach the mistake of Donald Trump, which was inflicted not just on them, but on us as well.
Jeff, briefly?
Yeah, I don't think, Mike, the way I see it, it's a question of getting apologies or making apologies to the rest of the world. But it is a question of understanding that the deterioration of trust of the United States has really accelerated. I mean, it wasn't so great before, but I mean, the president said the other night, people are saying, well, Biden says America is back, or whatever the phrase he used, but they're asking for how long. And I think any policy dealing with the kinds of things we're talking about internationally has got to start with a little humbleness, not because we're asking anybody to apologize for Trump. The embarrassment is obvious and great enough, but because we've got to understand that things have changed because of Trump. And it's not like it was 25 years ago when, you know, we could hold the reins of China's growth and we had the opportunity to do something there, and we blew it. But the world has changed in the last 4 years, and we just have to be sensitive to that.
I agree. We have to be sensitive, but at the same time, you know, our workers need to know that policies are working for them. I think that's the greatest way to have the president's back as he seeks to earn back the trust of our multilateral partners.
Thank you to all 5 of you for being here with us today. And thanks to Senator Bob Casey for getting us started with a set of ambitious and provocative comments. And thanks to all of you who attended and listened today. And thanks for your comments and questions. With that, I really appreciate all of the really interesting and thoughtful things that people have put forward in terms of both the challenges ahead, but also the opportunities ahead. I think this is an exciting moment. There is a lot of consensus around breaking down the silos, around connecting some of the issues that we have in terms of what we're trying to achieve domestically and how we use global trade policy and foreign policy to bring all those things together. How do we live our principles? How do we meet international standards and also ask other countries to rewrite the rules of the global economy so that workers can prosper, so that women can prosper, so that we can have a safe and healthy climate. So thanks to all of you for participating. Thanks to all the attendees today. And please check out our website, www.epi.org. We will have a recording of this event and others there for you to refer to later. Thanks again.